Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 77 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. So the Sharks were on a 10-game losing streak before that came to an end just a couple of days ago against the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Sharks won a very close game of 3-2, and any hopes of the Sharks then being able to string together at least a couple of wins together were shattered here tonight as the Sharks went up against a significantly better team, while the Blue Jackets were shorthanded and were even full strength, not a playoff team. The Blues currently are one of the best teams in the National Hockey League and one of the hottest teams in the National Hockey League, considering they have not lost a game in regulation in their last 14 games. And so while this wasn't an absolute domination by the Blues, which is, I guess, somewhat of a positive for the Sharks, this was a game that the Blues mostly controlled and would end up winning over the Sharks. Now, when it comes to the even strength play, at the very least, the Sharks didn't look too bad. They didn't really generate any sort of offense, but they didn't let the Blues do much of anything either. In fact, if we were to take a look at the high danger chances at even strength for the game here tonight, the Sharks would only have a single high danger chance, but the Blues would only have two. So these two teams would actually combine for 3 high danger chances. In most games, a single team would probably double, if not potentially even triple that in a particular game. So it was clearly very, very low event hockey at even strength, but this game was played pretty significantly and on the special teams, and in particular the Blues had multiple different power plays, which I was actually a bit disappointed with. Now, there are frequently, at least semi-frequently at the NHL level, some bad calls. It's something that is known from 1910 when they started the league to currently now in 2022. Refs will make bad calls, and I usually don't mention it besides maybe the off comment, but here tonight I thought there were so many of these weird calls that it's kind of hard to not say something. There was a early tripping from the Sharks that I thought was a perfectly fine call, but then we had this Mire holding penalty, which was probably the weakest holding penalty that I have seen in a very, very long time. Mire did technically touch the Blues player with his hand off of his stick, but there was no grabbing or holding motion. I don't even think Mire closed his hand around the Blues player, and yet it was called. And I remember the commentator at the time saying, "We'll see if the standard for that holding call continues for the game." Well, spoiler alert, it of course did not. There were no other holding calls. I'm sure there were 100 of other types of plays like this one. There are players touching other players with their hand off their stick a ton of times per game that never get called because they aren't holding penalties. But I don't know why Mire isn't given the benefit of the doubt in this situation, or what exactly is the case, but he is immediately called for something like this that I did not agree with. Then there was a delay of game penalty. Obviously, that's one's going to be called because it was a penalty by the letter of the law. But then there was a hooking penalty by, I believe it was Matt Nieto on Brayden Schenn, and you could argue whether this was indeed a hooking penalty, but I just mostly have a problem with how easily Brayden Schenn went down. I mean, it looked like someone shot him on the ice, and I thought at the very least, if you were going to give a hooking penalty to Nieto, you should probably give some sort of embellishment penalty to Brayden Schenn, but that didn't end up happening. And then another call on Scott Reedy for a roughing, which I also didn't really agree with. This is Scott Reedy turning around, and yes, he does get his arm up high, but I don't think this was anything super intentional from Scott Reedy, so I thought it was a bit of a harsh call. So generally, I didn't like the refereeing here tonight, but the fact is the Sharks had a single high danger chance in this particular game at even strength, so it's not as though with less power plays for the Blues that the Sharks would have had that much of a better chance of winning. But on to the actual game here. This one started off pretty well for the Sharks. Within just the first few minutes of this game, Noah Gregor would get the Sharks on the board to make it 1-0, and it looked like maybe there would be some hope here tonight, but that was quickly shattered as just a couple of minutes later, Joshua would tie the game for the Blues, and it would be a 1-1 game heading into the first intermission. In the second period early on, it would be Rob Thomas getting the lead for the Blues, and that would be a lead they would never relinquish, and the rest of the second period would go by with very, very little chances, like I mentioned, at even strength, and it was a 2-1 lead for the Blues. In the third period, still not much doing for the San Jose Sharks, and the only other goal in this game would be a Buchnevich empty netter in the last, dying seconds of this third period to make it 3-1 Blues. And I've mentioned time and time again in the past that the Sharks have just struggled so significantly at the 6-on-5 play when they've been down just a single goal, and that definitely did not change here tonight. It was actually just pitiful to watch the Sharks as a six-man unit. It didn't even seem like they were a six-man unit. Honestly, while they were technically a man up, it looked like they were kind of a man down. Players were constantly losing one-on-one puck battles, just absolutely zero support from their teammates. Bordelot was given time on the 6-on-5, which I was actually quite happy with, and it showed that Booner was having some confidence in his play, but Bordelot was having issues with the puck consistently. So was Mire, so was Burns. It was just an absolute mess, and the Blues had literally zero issue with dealing with the San Jose Sharks at 6-on-5. Like I said, it looked like it was the Sharks who were down a man and not the Blues. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Mire, Hertl, and Dallin. Now, I don't think these players looked completely awful, but they haven't really done much of anything in terms of scoring over these past few games, even if at times they have played well. You know, in that Columbus Blue Jackets game, I thought Mire, Hertl, and Dallin made up a pretty solid line, but of course, they haven't been contributing. And the issue, of course, here for the San Jose Sharks is that if Mire and Hertl aren't contributing, you don't really have a lot of players contributing. This is actually the polar opposite of the team that the Sharks just played against here tonight, the Blues, who have an abundance of players contributing. In fact, with Rob Thomas's 20th goal of the season here tonight, the Blues now have 8 20-goal scorers on their roster. The Sharks don't even have half of that, and so with Mire and Hertl not contributing, the Sharks just aren't getting much offense at all. And so we even saw a demotion for Timo Meier in this game, ended up getting some time with VL and Shemilevsky on the fourth line, and Booner had some pretty scathing comments at the end of the game for these two players. So it wasn't a terrible game for them, like I said, but they weren't doing much either. When it comes to the second line, they continue to surprise me because once again, I thought this second line was actually quite good, and in particular, the player who has impressed me the most would be Nick Bonino. It was just a few games ago that I dubbed him an offensive black hole, and I could technically stand by that statement because over a full 82-game season, you could say that that's somewhat the case, but it seems as though he took that insult to heart. You know, obviously he cares a lot about what I say, and over these past few games, he's actually been showing off some pretty solid offensive skills, and it has been his playmaking that has really stood out. He's been setting up some really solid chances for the San Jose Sharks. Obviously, this line did not end up contributing on the score sheet here tonight, but you could argue that they were the Sharks' best line once again. When it comes to the third line, Gregor, Bordelot, and Balcers once again kept together. Gregor, I thought, had another very solid game. Obviously, he scored the only goal for the San Jose Sharks and had a couple of other chances as well. When it comes to Bordelot, it's kind of not even useful to mention at this point that the defensive game is lacking because that's going to come along, and I suspect that over these last few games of the year, there's only 5 games remaining, that Bordelot's defensive game isn't suddenly going to take 10 leaps forward and be Patrice Bergeron levels. I suspect if anything is going to happen, it would happen over this upcoming off season, so it's not necessarily a huge deal and a huge point to continue to harp on that. And so when it comes to his offense, we saw more so the creativity. There weren't a lot of board battles won, which was something that I pointed out last game against the Blue Jackets as a potential strength for him. But he was showing off a lot of sort of William Eklund style plays. He was making some sort of spinorama type passes. He was looking for some crazy lanes to make feed the puck through. And this is kind of good news and bad news, because it's good news that he has the confidence to go for these types of plays and that he has the ability to go for these types of plays. But the bad news is that here tonight, the Blues read him like a book time and time again. And I believe there was not a single of these like really high skill plays that actually ended up working out. Maybe there was one that I'm not remembering at this point, but he has to be a bit less predictable in these strong skill plays if he wants to be able to do it, or he needs to be at an even higher level, because right now the other teams are just, or at least the Blues at the very least, are reading him well enough. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, I was a bit surprised to see a substitution. Well, I was a bit surprised, but also a bit unsurprised. We saw Reedy and Shemilevsky get back into the lineup, but VL would end up replacing Weatherby. it was a good fourth line for the Sharks when it was Chmelevski, Reedy, and Weatherby, so I thought they would be able to stay together, but I guess the logic from Bob Booner coming into this game is that they're going up against a St. Louis Blues team who is known to be very physical, and so he wanted a physical presence in the lineup with Jeff Viel. But the fact is that the Sharks are playing 5 games that don't really matter, and so they're not necessarily putting their 100% into it, and the Blues are playing 5 games that, well, they've already secured their playoff spot, and while they're obviously hoping for a higher point in the standings to try and get some home ice advantage or whatever, they're also coming up against a Sharks team. They don't want to get any injuries or anything like that, so they're probably not going to play that much of a physical game. So you definitely could have gotten away with having Weatherby in the lineup instead of VL, but I guess I understand the logic, and it's not the end of the world that this ends up happening. But this fourth line basically did nothing, I guess you could say, for the San Jose Sharks. I thought Chmelevski was probably the best player on the fourth line, which has honestly been the case over these past couple of games as well. When it comes to the defensive side of things, I already mentioned earlier that this was a very low event game, and so all of these defensemen actually played relatively well at the even strength level. On the power play, it's hard to necessarily criticize them a ton because you're playing a man down and you're against an extremely strong power play that the St. Louis Blues have, so I'm not going to necessarily criticize them in that particular facet of the game, but at even strength, they all looked good enough. I would say I was impressed enough with all of them. If there was one player who I do want to talk about, that would of course be the usual comment on Ryan Merkley, who I thought had a very nice play earlier on in this first period where he made this very beautiful stick handling play at the offensive zone blue line to keep the puck in, avoided a couple of Blues players who were looking to get the puck off of him and go the other way for a potential rush chance, and it ended up leading for a decent San Jose Sharks chance on net. So good on Merkley for that one, and that's really all there is to say there. And finally, when it comes to the goaltending, James Reimer was back between the pipes. Didn't necessarily have to do a ton here tonight, though on shorthanded he played decently well, though I will mention that the goal given up by him on Rob Thomas was not necessarily fantastic. We've seen multiple times this season that James Reimer has not necessarily been at his best when pucks have been going to the high glove side, and that's exactly what we saw on this Thomas goal. You could argue that Reimer was a bit screened, but this was something that you were hoping for a bit faster of a reaction from him to be able to make this save. But then again, Reimer only led in 2 goals here tonight. He gets 0 goal support pretty much every single game here when he plays behind this San Jose Sharks squad, just because of the lack of forward depth that they have, and so no real blame goes towards Reimer for this one. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they will take on the Chicago Blackhawks. They played the Blackhawks just a few days ago, about a week ago or so, and they lost to them in the shootout. So the Sharks are now 1-0-1 against them in the season series, and they'll hope to take the win. Class dismissed.